I just watched the original Dawn of the Dead. This is a member request from Jay. I thought it held up pretty well, considering it's almost 50 years old. It's pretty easy to see its influence with some of the deaths and the decisions and the strategies. The pacing of the movie is pretty frantic right from the get-go. It just starts you kind of right in the middle of it, which I'm sure was pretty innovative at the time, given that 70s movies seem to be more methodical in general. Obviously, you have stuff like Star Wars, but I think that was pretty atypical for the time. I thought a lot of the visuals looked really cool. Obviously, they're not all going to look the way that modern things will now, but the fact that it seems like it's all done practically, it all looks pretty gross with a lot of the zombie stuff. A little bit of it looks kind of doughy or cakey when they're ripping people's organs out, but overall, I think it looks pretty good. Something I thought was interesting was the choice to make the zombies blue. I don't know if this was a money thing or just kind of the consensus at the time or what the exact reasoning was for the decision. Obviously, with more modern stuff, they tend to be more green or have a lot more details in their face because of newer methods of makeup application and technology and all that sort of thing. But from a logical perspective, I actually kind of like the idea of sort of palish blue zombies, since that's what happens to people when they die. A lot of them will turn pale and kind of get this weird bluish hue to their skin if they're a white person. And I'd be really curious to see if a more modern movie went with the more bluish route, if they would be able to, with enough budget, give them more of like a deadish, feral kind of human feel, as opposed to what we usually get, which is kind of like infected by a virus or something strange. I like the idea of really emphasizing the death with the color. I was actually thinking about one of the sort of satirical aspects of the movie with the zombies walking around the shopping mall because they don't really know what to do. They just picked a place they're comfortable with. Obviously, they're not thinking. They're just wandering around the mall. Because I was thinking if that were to be adapted to today, as far as I'm aware, I don't think kids even hang out at malls anymore like that. I guess you'd have to set it in like an Amazon warehouse or something, since there's no way to really digitally communicate people being zombied out, as literal zombies at least. Obviously, you have other things you could do, like the movie Surrogates, where people just live in the internet. But as far as having actual zombies kind of being in a place where they're mindless, you couldn't even really adapt this now. Obviously, I know the one from the early 2000s exists, but even then, I think just the 20-year gap is huge, because malls all over the country are just out of business or being turned into apartments, or at least where I'm from, it's just kind of a ghost town. Half the shops aren't even open, and it feels kind of just empty all the time. So that was kind of an interesting thing about how the social commentary would have to be wildly changed to adapt it today, I think. I feel like I say this with every older movie that you guys have picked, but they fit so much into the 2 hours, and the characters are so well established. It's kind of crazy how just focusing on one small group of people with a relatively simple plot line is just so much more compelling than trying to jam in a dozen characters and being all over the place and having a bunch of subplots. You just focus on one group and let their story play out, and it makes for a much better theatrical experience than half the shit we get right now. You have your couple of Steven and Francine, your couple of guys with military experience of Roger and Peter, and right away the movie just starts off with chaos. The audio is all jacked up, it's hard to hear them talk, it's really stressful, and everyone's just arguing, they don't know what to do. So these four just try to survive and get the hell out of there. They find a mall and just try to seal it off and hold up. Nothing complex, nothing convoluted. Very logical choice that they're going to keep traveling, but then once they get to the mall, they're like, well, we've got a ton of stuff here. Why keep going? There's a gun store, food, water, plumbing, electricity, entertainment. It's a very simple way to pick kind of a utopia in this shitty situation that totally makes sense, but obviously can't work out in the long term. I recently talked about this in my 28 Days Later video, because in that movie, the raging people turn super fast and it creates a different kind of tension. This one does the slow zombies and the slow transformation into a zombie. And there's something about people doing the slow transformation that I find more emotionally compelling. The idea that you're on your way to death and you know it, and seeing how people respond and the people around you respond is kind of a cheat code to get automatic emotional scenes. And obviously, this is something that happens in real life when people have terminal illnesses. If you ever gone through that with a loved one where It's not if, it's a matter of when. It's a really horrible experience to go through, and depending on the situation can last months or even years. And there is a bit of a bittersweetness there where you do know it's coming and you get to say your goodbyes and it's not sudden and surprising. But then there's the entire component of kind of watching someone that you love just deteriorate. And I think the zombie with the slow transformation really allows that feeling to hit home without being too relatable in general, because you're turning into a monster instead of slowly withering away. And in this movie, I think it's interesting too, because when Roger gets bitten, I actually was unsure if they even knew if people turned or not because of how they initially responded. But then Peter says, I've seen half a dozen people get bit before. None of them ever even make it 3 days. So you kind of get an immediate timeline. You know the consequences and the inevitability of the situation. I think it's interesting to see all of their behavior knowing that, Roger in particular, because I actually think it says a lot about a person, or in this case, a character, that even knowing that he's on death's doorstep and there's no escaping it, he still goes out with them, tries to block up all the entrances, drives the car for him and hot wires it, risks himself getting bitten even more. And he gets a thumb in his wound, which is disgusting. And even though he's dying and knows that this already cost him his life, he commits to it to the end to help them have a peaceful setup for after he's gone. They also give Steven a pretty interesting arc, which I think would be absolutely fucking butchered today, where he's knocked up Francine, she's pregnant, and he wants to protect her, but he simply doesn't have the skill set or the competence at this point in time. And we see this throughout the movie where he can't hit a shot. He shoots with Peter in his line of fire without thinking because he's inexperienced. He's essentially only good at flying the helicopter. We see him completely fuck up over and over trying to kill zombies, getting himself in bad spots. And then all of this kind of comes to a head, even though there's no huge emotional outburst, when Francine is like, leave a gun with me. I need to learn how to shoot. And also, I want you to teach me to fly the helicopter. Like, she wants to become independent enough to be able to survive on her own in case something happens to him, which is a very reasonable perspective in this situation, obviously. But given the times, the idea of a woman's independence was probably a bold, creative decision. This is kind of one of the things that stood out for Star Wars in the same era with Princess Leia. And the reason I say it would be butchered now is because he would be some kind of whining, simpering man baby, or he'd be outrageously angry and probably fucking smack her. I don't think they would allow for the subtlety of just him being kind of frustrated and pissed off at her. Her understanding that she might have made him feel emasculated to the point where she apologizes, but they both go forward with it anyway because it is the right decision. And it's not this huge outburst or meltdown. It's just kind of something that happens and makes sense. And then they move on, which is what mature adults would do, hopefully. I was really glad they included this little part where they are finally stable, but you can see they're kind of just bored and going crazy. They've got all of this supplies. They've got their safety as relatively safe as they can be given the circumstance. And they just kind of seem to not have purpose. And I think it's an interesting way to show that simply living isn't going to be enough for most people once peace is established. And it seems to me like this movie was kind of the originator of the trope of eventually, once the zombies are dealt with, you still have to deal with other people. And obviously the whole idea that people and zombies aren't that different isn't super explored in this movie, but it clearly shows that people can be as destructive, if not worse, since they actually have the capacity to be creative with their destructiveness. I actually read online that the alternate ending was originally that they're just so overrun that Peter and Francine just kill themselves. And I get why it makes sense from a existential dread perspective and sort of a logistics perspective of the world being reset. But I'm glad it didn't go that route. I think it is nice to end a zombie movie with more of a message of hope and perseverance and all those sorts of things that tend to make humanity special in both fantasy and sci-fi. And the last thing I'll say is that I really liked a lot of the creative deaths. You get the fun with the helicopter blade cutting off a guy's head. Kind of have the rednecks just hunting him for sport out in the middle of nowhere. You get the screwdriver in the ear. You obviously get hammers and gun butts, and some of them are rolled up while they're alive for their last rites. You get them all being run over with a truck, which I'm sure was all done practically. Guy getting thrown off the second floor. Just a bunch of fun ways to destroy brains and brain stems that aren't TikTok. Obviously, the characters were smart, but they took calculated risks the whole movie, which is always fun. I like the idea of them trying to hide and build like a decoy wall and all that stuff. It just does a lot of really good things that we've seen expanded on in the zombie genre over time, including a neat little thing where they start grabbing tools and those sorts of things to attack as well, which I thought was fun. The only sort of issue that I had was one, I didn't understand the blood pressure guy and like why he was so focused on that he just got eaten alive. I actually Googled it because I was curious if I just missed something, but it just seems like he was a retard. And then in general, just how easy they were able to fend off the zombies. That's kind of a struggle with slow zombies in general. But you know, it's one of those weird consistency things where sometimes they have to wrestle one just one-on-one for their life and get bitten. And then sometimes they just run through a crowd, punching them in the face, karate kicking them and not giving a shit. Obviously not egregious. It's relatively consistent throughout the movie, but it is one of those things that I think if you play with it too much can really undermine the threat that the zombies are. Now, obviously the movie ends with the zombies just swarming over these bandits. So that's all just wiped away regardless. But there was kind of a weird playful tone for the middle section of the movie that I found kind of strange, even though it was generally fun. But overall, I thought it was a pretty good movie, held up pretty well. It'd be interesting to see a not Zack Snyder remake. Even though I haven't seen it myself, to be fair, it's pretty popular. Super easy to see how influential it's been, and just a really fun time overall. So this is a good pick from Jay. Thanks for the request. I'm gonna leave this one here. If you've seen it, let me know what you think, or let me know how the remake is. I haven't seen it. I try to respond to the comments that aren't just insults, like and subscribe and all that shit. Thanks. See ya.